Thank you all so much for being here today, for braving the perceived snow, the myth of snow, for some of you, maybe the actuality of snow. My name is Stacy Richardson. I'm the Senior Director of Collaborations here at the Bloomberg Center for Cities. We fancy ourselves as a hub for research, teaching, and field work that equips current and future local leaders with the tools to address complex urban challenges. And we are so excited today to host a conversation about cities after dark, 24-hour governance, and the role of night mayors. It is a very fitting topic for us here in Boston, considering that we have entered into the time of year where it now gets dark at 3 p.m. So our director of Nightlife is working overtime. So we are very appreciative of her joining us today, considering those long hours you are working. Before we get into this really exciting panel and content, I have a few very boring housekeeping items. In case of an emergency, please exit the center calmly. You may do so through the center doors that you entered in through, or you may proceed to the right and then to the left to exit out the rear. I hope that everybody here today will check our website, cities.harvard.edu, as we have a full listing of future events and ways that you can engage with the center as a student, as a faculty member, or as a city leader. We have over 490 folks joining us online who registered for today's event, and so we'll hope that you will continue to join us for future opportunities as well. And without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today's conversation. Dr. Adrina Cejas has more than 15 years of experience working in urban development and policy and is an alum of the Harvard Graduate School of Design. She's currently working at her own firm called Night Tank, which works at the intersection of research and practice, focusing on life at night, helping cities and organizations design and implement sustainable, inclusive, and future-oriented strategies that enhance their nighttime ecosystems. Please join me in welcoming Adrina back to the Harvard campus.
Thank you so much, Stacy. Hello, everyone. Can you hear me well? Yes? Mm-hmm. I'm very happy to be here. Good morning, and thanks to all of you for making it here, regardless of the weather we have outside, and also for all of you tuning in to this conversation about 24-hour cities. Stacy just mentioned, I'm very happy to be back. It's been 5 years since I was here in Cambridge, and I'm very honored to moderate this conversation with this fantastic panel about the relevance of 24-hour approach to managing our cities. And well, for those of you who don't know me, I've been specializing in this field for a while, and today I'm currently based in Barcelona in Spain. And I'm happy to return and bring this conversation as it's still a field that has been evolving over the past 15 years. And we have today a set of local and international experts who will help us unpack what it means to have and to plan and to think in 24-hour terms. Before we get into the panel discussion and I introduce our fantastic panel, I want to give you a brief overview and background on why this field matters. So when we think about understanding urban life, there's no better way to understand urban life than by observing it. So when you think about what's the simplest unit of observation is a bench in a park. And when you think about this bench in this park, the same space has different uses and users throughout the 24-hour cycle. But unfortunately, until very recently, half of the day, which is the night, has been an invisible and an absent space when it comes to urban planning and policy. Time, however, like space, is a key factor when managing cities. And there's very interesting studies that come from cities in Italy, from geographers in France, from all over the UK and from Australia that started around 20, 30 years ago, looking at time as a variable to plan cities proactively. And this is what time-based urbanism is concerned with. When I came to Boston the first time in 2017, one of the articles that I ran into was this one from Ed Glazer in the Boston Globe. And I really like this piece called Better Nightlife Through Experimentation because it invites us to think about the night from an opportunity perspective. How he invited in this very brief piece, he invited us to think about how we could plan different nighttime districts in Boston, but think about it even like through an RCT model. So what if we did some randomized controlled trials and tested different variables and different factors that impact the way that nighttime is distributed in the city? And what I liked is that nighttime policy should be mapped, measured, and tested. So at the time when this was 2017, I started doing these maps to understand what are the different factors that impact life at night. On one hand, from a hardware perspective, so the infrastructure, what hours the T is running, the night buses, but also from the software perspective, What's the distribution of liquor licenses? What are the regulations, the codes? But soon I realized that aside from the hardware and the software, there was a third element that we needed to map. And this was the institutions. And during that time, I realized that there was something going on in the media. All these headlines were popping up. So what is a night mayor? What is a night czar? So you want to be a night mayor. And what was that about? So I thought, well, we need to map, we need to understand who are these people, who are these new roles that were emerging around the world. And to do that, I also noticed that there was a misconception, a lot of myths and confusion around what the role was. Because when you do a quick search of a night mayor, in pop culture, this is what comes up. You get all these like terrifying creatures that, you know, are out all night, they don't sleep, they're there to terrify citizens. So there's a lot of confusion of what the night mayor is, and we'll talk about it in the panel. But at the moment I thought, so I need to unpack this and understand this better. And I was here at Harvard at the moment, and I decided to study this phenomenon. And in fact, the first person to call himself a night mayor was this man, Jules Delder, a poet from Rotterdam in the Netherlands. But the actual first night mayor, or the one who popularized the term, was Mirek Milan, who was night mayor in Amsterdam for many years. And here's when he was appointed for the second term. And he's the person who was responsible for creating some innovations, such as the square hosts in Rembrandtplein, which is one of the densest nightlife areas in Amsterdam. And you have these people patrolling the streets on weekends and helping de-escalate violence and helping the police. And then you also have innovations such as the 24-hour licenses or permits that were introduced to enable that under one roof you could have cultural, you could have community and nightlife uses throughout the day. But then, so I reached out to Mirek and I said, hey, so we have a problem. There's all these night mayors coming up, but nobody really understands what they're doing, and we don't even know how many they are. If you know everyone, if you tell me, if you help me find, reach them out, can we do a qualitative study? And he's like, yeah, let's do it. So that's what we did. So in 2020, we decided to map night mayors. And we did a qualitative study. At the time, there were only 35 cities that had night mayors, or well, 34, and San Francisco had 2 roles at the moment. And we did a survey that we distributed in English and in Spanish, asking questions about, so who are these people, what age they are, what kinds of resources they have, do they have a team, if their role is enshrined in, or protected by legislation, what are their contributions? And the results were published in a paper that came out in the journal in Urban Studies in 2020 and led to the first map of night mayors, which is the one you can see now. Yeah, there it is. So this was the map that we released, we produced based on the information we gathered with this qualitative study. And one thing we noticed is that there's a lot of differences in the night mayors around the world. There's some of them that are within City Hall, and some of them are independent advocates. And a very important thing to note is that context matters. So every city has its own reason, vision, regulations, history to appoint these roles. So it's very important to understand that it's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but something that has been evolving around the world. And then, of course, we know what happened. So we went from this to this overnight during COVID, and this had a huge impact on nighttime governance as a movement around the world. And I look at Diane right now, Diane Davis, who was my advisor at the moment, and I remember a piece of advice you gave me when you said, my dissertation was ready, and Diane told me, you should write an epilogue on how this whole COVID pandemic that is going to be long will impact the movement that we're seeing in all these night mayors. And it was a great piece of advice, because what actually happened was that COVID changed the way in which night mayors communicated. It created a nighttime community that gathered around solutions. So this came out in 2020, the Global Nighttime Recovery Plan, a set of documents, reports that brought together all these night mayors and advocates from around the world. A WhatsApp group that right now there's more than 100 people, I don't know how many we have in the group, with all the night mayors started communicating. So it's like, good morning, we're here in Vienna and we have these closures. Oh, in Berlin, we have these illegal raves. Oh, in New York, we need to do something about the sidewalks. So there was a community coming together thanks to what was happening in the world with this crisis. And what this led to was that also cities started producing knowledge and sharing this knowledge. So this paved the way for nighttime strategies like the ones you can see here, from Italy to Barcelona to New York to London. Cities started sharing this knowledge and creating this global community of knowledge and practice, and a field that has been consolidating over the past 10 years. And some of these strategies include very intense and very, very dedicated and granular maps, such as these ones from Barcelona, but not all the maps are top-down. Some of them are bottom-up. So in some cases, this is a picture from my students in Paris, in Sciences Po. I teach a class where I invite students to use an app to walk around public spaces at night and to gather perceptions of space around comfort, around safety, around inclusion. So it also is an invitation to help us think about how cities can incorporate citizen views into the way they plan and they organize and they design policies for life at night. And today, so as I said, it's a consolidated field. If you go to this website, archive.nighttime.org/map, you can actually see the current map of night mayors and how it's been changing. Also, you can see below, there's a number of organizations that have come up to support this field. So there's a Nighttime Foundation that was recently created. There's regional and national organizations such as Nightcap Alliance in the US, RHI, and there's all kinds of networks and international organizations like the World Economic Forum, the OECD, World Cities Culture Forum that are now participating in shaping this field. So it's a very exciting time, and that's why I'm very happy to be here and to have this panel to share with you why this field matters and why we should think in terms of 24 hours. But I'm almost done, but I wanted to leave you with 3 ideas so we can then kick off the panel. 3 lessons. The first is that life at night is more than nightlife. What does this mean? It's not just about going out. It's also about those who work at night. And one thing we've been seeing around the world is that sometimes we don't think about the needs and the situation of those who are traversing the city at night, delivering our food or providing services. So it's important to think about these elements when we plan the city after dark. It's a broad ecosystem of different kinds of actors that are involved in the 24-hour cycle. So expanding and really understanding what their role is very important. Second is life at night is not a monolithic experience. It is impacted by our gender, impacted by our age, impacted by our capacity to, whether we're on the spectrum or neurodiversity. It's also conditioned by climate. So there's cities around the world where the night is not an option. The night is the space where they meet, where they socialize, where they gather. And there's a very important concern now as we're seeing climate change to understand what are the implications and the connections between climate change and night. The more we adapt, we will need to move into later hours, some of our activities to change our schedules. And as we do that, we will need to mitigate the impacts that has on climate change. This is a picture from the beaches in Dubai. I had the opportunity to see them a few weeks ago. It's fantastic how with simple solutions such as good lighting, you can enable all kinds of nighttime activity for children and families after dark. And it's important to think about from an adaptation perspective how we're already seeing shifts in the way we behave. This is a study that came out today in Nature. It's a paper I'm happy to share with the audience if you're interested, that looks at how using transaction data, we were able to see how when there's peak heat events, people spend and consume more at night, and how that will impact the way we'll have to think about our schedules and our services in cities. And we're living a 24-hour turn. We're moving into just thinking into the night and how it connects to the day by focusing on the 24-hour economy. And I hope this is an inspiring invitation and opportunity for you to think in these terms, but to get more granular, more specific, and more detailed, I now want to give the opportunity to this fantastic panel. I'm here with Corean Reynolds, the Director of Nightlife Economy for the City of Boston, the first one that Boston has ever had. Also, here with Garnette Cadogan from MIT, the professor who's been teaching a class. How many years already? It's been the nighttime class?
It's the 21-22 academic year. So like 4 years.
4 years. So 4 years teaching a class on the city at night. So inviting young students and young minds to think about the night as a space of opportunity and a space we have to be critical about. And then we also have Mathieu Grondin, who's coming from Ottawa. He's the Nightlife Commissioner of the city, also the first one that Ottawa has had, and someone who's been working in the nighttime space in Canada for the past 10 years or so, and been very influential in this conversation. So I'm very happy to have this international panel today and to be here at the Bloomberg Center. And I'm going to start this conversation let's start local. We're here in Cambridge and the Boston area. And one thing, so last night we met to have dinner and share impressions, because I think, as I mentioned before, one of the interesting elements about this global community of nighttime advocates and is that we we are always exchanging knowledge and exchanging pointers and learning from each other. And last night, one thing we were saying is how there's a lot of misconceptions about the role still. So we did this study in 2020. There's been, it's growth, many more cities appointing these night mayors, managers. But what do they actually do? And we have two first timers here. We also have from New York, the first executive director of the Office of Nightlife, Ariel Palitz here. And we have Jeff Garcia, the current executive director of the Office of Nightlife, who's also been in these roles. But it's interesting to see how they're different from city to city. But I want to ask you, Corean, how can this broader mandate from your role, you've seen that it's often misunderstood by being focused solely on bars and clubs, but you serve as a liaison across different departments in the city of Boston. How do you think this broader mandate has helped you put forward your role, and how do you think it's changed and evolved since you started in 2023?
Well, thank you for having me. Thanks for everyone coming down to Boston and having this conversation. In 2023, when Mayor Michelle Wu appointed this position, I was charged with a task to not only revitalize sociability in the city of Boston, but also look how we can strengthen our overall economy, our overall 24-hour economy, by focusing on our nighttime economy. So this mandate was beyond bars, restaurants, and nightclubs, but to really think through all of the industries that serve our nighttime economy. So yes, hospitality and entertainment is a large industry, and that's one that I focus on. But we also have world-class hospitals and healthcare systems. So how do we think through the people who work there at night? We also have different city services that are happening at night, and we have a bit of a reputation of nothing good happens past 10 p.m. in the city. I think a former mayor may have said that. And we also have a bit of a reputation of being a boring city. And so a part of my role is to change that perspective and to change culture in the city and see how we can support and give access to the resources that folks who work from 9 to 5 have to those who work past those hours.
Thank you so much. And moving from Boston all the way to Ottawa, what has been your perspective being the first person to occupy this position? And tell us a little bit about the background on how you got into this role and how you've seen take shape over the past year.
Well, I think there's a lot of similarities with what you've been experiencing. There's a lot of misperceptions about the position when I got in. People see night mayors as the official party planner of City Hall,
Yes.
but it's really a policy-making position. The role of the Nightlife Commissioner is to head the Nightlife Council, which is our advisory board. It's also to implement the Nightlife Economy Action Plan. It's to act as a liaison between our external partners, so yes, hospitality, the businesses, the cultural sector, the different trade organizations impacted by nightlife, but also all the different departments inside City Hall. Because nightlife governance is an all-encompassing, it's not just one thing, it's not just culture or economic development or tourism or safety or public health, it's all of these things. So developing what I call the nightlife reflex inside City Hall, so whenever there's a project that comes up, applying a nightlife lens on it, is part of the role because people at City Hall, bureaucrats, politicians, are daytime people. They get to work early and they go to bed early, and they make decisions that impact people who live and work at night. But they never get to see the outcomes of these decisions. So that's why these positions are important.
One thing you said, so it's very interesting to think about the concept of nighttime governance itself, and how what we're seeing is that it refers to this broader cast and growing cast of actors and institutions involved in managing cities at night. Going from the night mayors to these advisory boards and councils, and also these different type of civic bodies and entities that cities are creating to bring these solutions more to the ground. But going from night governance and night mayors back to the night itself, Garnette, I know we've talked a lot about how all the misconceptions that exist around the night as a space. And I would love to, if you can share with us a little bit about your experience, not only through teaching the class, but as someone who's fascinated and been studying the night for a long time. What's the challenge, the main challenge, and why is it so hard to really understand what's the meaning and the relevance of the night?
I think Corean sums it up, by saying she entered the office fighting against that idea that nothing good happens after 10 p.m. And so the night is something that's often associated with fear or with immorality. And so the night is something to be policed or to be managed, but managed along the vector of our fears, rather than seen as a time and a space of possibility, of opportunity, of enriching coexistence. And so instead of a thoughtful approach by asking, what might the night offer us? Why do people attach themselves to the night? How to see the night as something that people go towards rather than something to be, that we should flee from. Then it begins to open so much more. Also, you recognize, at least I teach in architecture and urban planning, and time and again, you have the sense that for everybody, the projects end at 9 p.m. And you ask, well, what is it like to walk here at 2 o'clock in the morning? Or what is it like to be here in a pre-dawn? How does the city shift its rhythms, its moods, its expectations, its sense of itself? How does identity evolve between 4 p.m. and say 10 p.m.? But also what happens when the curtains go down? Third shift workers or people are unhoused or transportation. And so people thinking about transportation, climate change, economic development, urban design, environmental policy, and so on and so on and so on. There's no way to properly deal with that or to think about it in all its richness and its multitudinousness without thinking about the night and without properly engaging with the night. But I'd also argue that there's no way to actually properly understand the day if you don't understand the night. And so it's not merely looking at the night to understand the night, but it's looking at the night to actually properly understand the day. That I found time and again my students or people we're interacting with, as they begin to open up their understanding of the night, they suddenly begin to shift their understanding of the day and recognize how truncated their views and their understanding and their comprehension of the day and all the work and associations with it that they had need to shift, need to change, need to evolve, need to expand.
One thing that we've discussed a lot is how, and also last night we were reflecting on, is how the size of the city impacts the night, the view of the night or the perceptions of the night or the way they manage the night. I think I want us to get a bit into the nitty-gritty of what it means to be in these kinds of roles and to really plan the night. And one thing, and I'm also looking at questions that are starting to come in, people being interested in how to grow a healthy nightlife in cities that are not as big as New York, because of course New York is the biggest inspiration and the biggest reference when it comes, the city that doesn't sleep. But when it comes to Boston and when it comes to Ottawa, how do we tackle this? What are the challenges and what's the first step to understand what's the priority and to come up with a plan to tackle that in a strategic way?
When it comes to Ottawa, we have kind of like the same branding problem as Boston. We are seen as a bureaucratic city. 25% of our workforce works for the federal government. So this creates unique challenges in developing a strong cultural sector, for instance, because you can always have a job that pays more at the government. Mid-sized cities, right now, there's a huge appetite for developing nightlife activities and these kinds of positions or nightlife strategies. And the focus is really more on development. Whereas in bigger cities like New York or London, I think the origin of creating these positions was more about managing the negative externalities, the problems with the residents and sometimes the overconsumption of alcohol, incivilities in the public space. Whereas in Ottawa, of course, this is always part of the job, but it's really more about developing nightlife. And I think now in a post-COVID world, where habits have changed, consumer habits have changed, inflation has hit hard, so affordability is a huge issue, especially for students, which is your primary audience for nightlife activities. And now when you have to choose between going out and paying your rent, usually, well, if you're not like me, you're going to pay your rent. So I think developing placemaking projects, so animating public spaces that are free and accessible to all, is a good segue into bringing people out again, because we are fighting the home by 10 trend right now, and let's just say stay home and watch Netflix, and it's cheaper, or just getting a gym membership right now. This is what we hear about, the new trends of the Gen Zs, but I think, to me, it's not so much a wellness movement more than an affordability problem that we're facing right now. So cities must engage in that, and I think animating your public space and starting also to consider nightlife venues as proper cultural spaces that could be funded through public funding or philanthropy. The way we fund museums or the Philharmonic Orchestra is going to be a discussion that's going to be interesting for the next few years.
Very interesting. And I think made me think about also the role that nighttime activity and nightlife and culture play in attracting people and keeping them in the city. And we were talking about this, and I wonder, Corean, if we can talk about a little bit. So Boston is a city that brings all this talent.
Yeah.
What role does life at night play in keeping them here, and how can we make it a more central part of the strategy?
Yeah, so Boston also has that affordability issue, but so does New York, and so does places in California. And when we're thinking about from a competitiveness standpoint and from an economic standpoint, we want to attract some of the biggest, best companies to, put some roots in the ground, like we've done with Lego and Hasbro and Eli Lilly. But they're not going to come to Boston if nobody wants to live in Boston. And so investing in the night is investing in talent attraction, and it's investing in someone's life, really, because you'll get a good job, but what is around that? How do we play? How do we heal? How do we communicate? How do we interact with each other? Those are the things that the night can serve someone who works a traditional 9-to-5 job. But then also, I think about Boston. It's only a little over 600,000 people. It's small. We have 23 different neighborhoods with 23 different characteristics and identities. And so what we've done early on in the process of seeing how do we serve these 23 different neighborhoods, because nightlife looks differently in all of those neighborhoods, is we put out an open call. And we said, what do you want to see at night in your neighborhood? Is it kayaking on the Charles? with light up kayaks, or is it a rock concert that focuses on women in rock? And so we got an outpouring of different activities and perspectives and communities coming together to solve for the night and introducing folks to how to interact with each other within their different neighborhoods.
You mentioned kayaking. It's interesting. So last week in Barcelona, we had the first spa rave. So it's a new trend. Now it's there's an intersection of wellness, because wellness is on the rise. And why not combine wellness with things we love, like good music and good DJ? So it's a new trend, and it's interesting to see how the definition of nightlife might be changing, or maybe the way we used to look at it is changing, also impacted by new generations. We keep hearing this, that how Jen said is really transforming the way we consume, socializing and looking for new spaces and new avenues to meet each other. And I look at you, Garnette, because I would like to discuss a little bit what you've seen through your students in the class and how that definition is shifting. And also, we talked a lot yesterday about skills. So there's something there. So younger generations having a new way of looking at the night, but at the same time, us trying to unpack what does that mean, and what does that and policymaking meet? How do we better understand what the youth needs and define nightlife in a way that we can, enable it in our cities?
Well, I'm not sure what you mean by youth. They're the teenagers and they're the 25-year-olds. But to say, we often think of it with a younger generation to say, oh, kayaking or, the wellness movement and spa raves. But I've also found with a lot of my younger students, issues of equity at the forefront of their mind and thinking about equity. And the night, often, we think of the night or the discussions around the night. One of the misperceptions is that, oh, to think about the night or to think of what night commissioners, night czars, night mayors, directors of offices of nightlife do, they try to make the night more fun, or it's focused really in a cultural position. But in many ways, it's about governance, it's about policy, dealing with bureaucracy. And one of the things that the four people here and many others deal with is to think about the night and equity. To think about transportation is an equity issue. To think about the people, like for example, Boston has so many people working at night in hospitals. What about the night and them? It's about equity. Or for example, if you walk through poor neighborhoods, or the neighborhoods that don't have the resources, or that are under-resourced, they often have too much light or too little night. And so I think, for example, that organization here in Boston, Light Justice, that Edward Bartholomew runs, in which he moves through neighborhoods, and I've taken my students through neighborhoods. So let's do a light audit of this neighborhood. You're in the habit of doing master plans. Let's do a light master plan. And they're moving through and suddenly recognize that, oh yes, this is too much light or too little light, or here they're lighting infrastructure and here they're lighting buildings, but almost never lighting people. But then once you reach into the wealthier neighborhoods, you recognize how much the lighting is lighting people and not just infrastructure and buildings. And so, often what's on their mind, is issues of equity. And suddenly the eureka moments when we're recognizing how much the night becomes a way to actually tackle a lot of these issues around equity, whether it be climate change, whether it be stuff around inequality, economic development, who gets a liquor license, which is a whole other trail, we're head down, and which neighborhoods get to have that kind of leisure. And in ways, leisure is also an equity thing. But also, a lot of them are thinking, oh, I don't drink, or I can't afford to drop $4 to $5 on cocktails if I do drink. Is a night only for those who are well off? How can a night and the kind of public spaces available, the ways in which people can gather, they can linger, become something to think about? Or actually, who gets to linger, which is the next equity issue. It's both social and an equity issue. Who's lingering and who is loitering. And so to think about the night is to think about issues around zoning, to think about issues around equity, to think about issues with transportation. And so often, what they're thinking about is so many of the things that we often associate with the night, leisure, culture, play, entertainment, but also equity and how it intersects with all of these.
You just mentioned, I think what you just described was how interdisciplinary this field is. And that's one of the main challenges at the core of managing cities at night. So if you want to plan and manage a city at night, you have to know a little bit about liquor licenses, you have to know about community engagement, you have to know about a little bit of planning, you have to know about some design elements, safety, culture. It's so broad. Economic development, tourism. So I think it's really interesting to understand in your day-to-day jobs as night mayors of your cities, what kinds of skills have you had to develop? Because when you arrived in the role, one thing that we've seen, and also in New York, is that these roles are changing. They are not set in stone, and there's a lot of confusion, and then they change. And what kinds of skills have you had to learn on the job, or what do you think could be interesting to promote, so that kind of information do you think or abilities would be handy to be able to develop this work better?
Well, one of my favorite parts about this job is I'm giving voice to folks who didn't naturally or traditionally have voice at City Hall. It's the folks, it's your barbacks, it's your nurses that are working overnight, it's the DoorDash folks that are working at night. And I call myself a little bit of a nightlife therapist, because they didn't have that direct line to City Hall. And so once they found me, they were like, let me tell you about my experience. And so I've kind of collected all of this lived experience from the folks who are making our cities thrive at night, and have this enormous job of really thinking through, how do I turn this lived experience and these barriers and these opportunities into policy, into programming, into resources. And so that being that liaison is really important, not only externally, but also internally. So now I have to translate what I'm hearing out in the streets, per se, to my colleagues. So talking to police officers and saying, these are what clubs are saying. They need more detail on the street to disseminate these large crowds, right? Or maybe it's someone saying, hey, I can't get a bite to eat at night. Let me talk to the small business team and say, how can we expand our food truck program to serve in our evening time? And how can we put those locations in populated areas at night so that it's serving the folks that it needs to serve? Because a spot that works for a food truck during the day is not necessarily going to work at night. And we've learned that through the process of piloting different initiatives to address those issues.
If you can maybe remind us, because we're getting questions about where your role is situated and how and like what kinds of skills you've seen. You mentioned like this when you mentioned about the being the therapist at night. There's of course a lot of mental health elements also that come into play.
Exactly.
Can you tell us, before I move to Mathieu, where your role is situated within City Hall and how you report and connect with the other departments?
Definitely. So my role is situated within the Office of Economic Opportunity and Inclusion. Within that cabinet, I'm cross-cutting across a few different departments that are kind of my like artillery. We have cultural and tourism, sports and entertainment going on in that cabinet. We also have our small business unit. Licensing is also a part of this particular cabinet, and so I have a close relationship with those folks. But then also my role goes to working with our community safety team, working with the folks who are focused on our youth engagement, working with police officers, like I've said, or public health. So really, it runs the gambit, and I love how City Hall, the way we've structured it within this administration, is that cross collaboration is encouraged. And this job wouldn't be able to be successful if that collaboration did not exist. And so a large part of my role is befriending a lot of folks across City Hall and creating these relationships to ensure that my constituents, our constituents, are served in a way that they haven't been before.
Mathieu, let's go back a little bit and mention about the Nightlife Economy Action Plan that has been influential in shaping your role. You can tell us a little bit about that plan and the recommendations that were part of it, and how that has shaped the work you do and the actions that are part of your scope.
Well, the plan was adopted by council a year before I took the position, and it's made up of 10 recommendations. And the first recommendation was to create this position of Nightlife Commissioner that would head the Nightlife Office. The Nightlife Office in Ottawa is part of the Economic Development Services, which is part of the Strategic Initiatives Department. You mentioned translation, and I think it's a fundamental word to describe what we're doing, because nightlife people don't speak the same language as daytime people, especially not government people. And it's part of my job to translate their needs and their perception, the perspective on things into a language that bylaw officers will understand, for instance. And when we come in, usually applying this nightlife lens to these different issues usually means doing things differently. So I really see these positions as change management's position. We are disruptors in the machine, but there's also limits to that, because we're just internal advocates. So, people mention transit all the time, but I don't have the power. Even though we're called night mayors, we have no executive powers at all. So I can't just snap my fingers and add more buses at night, but I can try and have these discussions. So And when you bring in change, that means you bring in sometimes hard discussions. So I think the best skills I've developed is, having a political acumen when you speak with the councillors, and diplomatic skills, and being able sometimes when you hit a wall, take a step back, find other allies, and then try to, address the same issues from another point of view, or another side. To get it moving, and changing takes time. And I think when this position was created in Ottawa, there was a buildup of like 9 months of who's going to be the night mayor. And when I took the positions, the expectations were that within 6 months you would see a lot of change, but it takes years to get to change big machines like cities. So this must be a long-term effort that includes a lot of political commitment and funding to get there. And in 10 years, we'll be able to look at this and see really what the results and outcomes of making all these changes have been.
We've talked a lot about the policies and the institutional ecosystem that has to exist to support these 24-hour mindset. But from the infrastructural perspective, what needs to be in place? What's important to have in cities from lighting, transportation, infrastructure development that you've seen that helps shape this, enable this to happen?
There has to be buy-in from the top. If your mayor or your city manager is not committed to the work of the person who's managing the night, then it will not be successful. It has to be seen as important so that the folks who are in other departments also take it as seriously as you are doing it day to day. And it's also having a collaborative spirit, because sometimes it's one person doing it, sometimes it's a group of folks doing it. And so being agile and ensuring that that person is set up for success in the way of introductions and resources, that's super important for a successful person in this role.
Well, I think when it comes to transit is always the first thing that comes up. And usually when there's problem with transit at night, there's usually problems with transit during the day too. And in post-COVID, in a lot of North American cities, that our downtowns have changed a lot. There's a lot of social issues. We have a huge unhoused population now in Ottawa, and this creates safety issues, or at least perception of safety issues. But that's also a problem. That's a 24-hour a day. So, you can't, there's a limit to what these roles can accomplish. And sometimes the perceptions of the public are that you can address all these big infrastructure issues. But, to get there, as you mentioned, you really need buy-in from the top. You need a mayor and a council that is supportive. And thankfully in Ottawa, I've been able to have that. But even then, there's an education part that needs to happen. It's going to take a few terms of council, I think, to get there. That if you're going to need money to illuminate the city, you're going to need money to have more buses at night. But sometimes you feel like these problems are as important during the day, as I said. So you need support from them. So.
And you have to be clear about what you're doing and what you're not doing, right? What you can do and what you can't do.
You want to add, Garnette?
I think time and again, if you go online, there's all these complaints. I'm out at 2 o'clock partying. Where's Mathieu? I don't see Mathieu. Or, I've been at the clubs. Where's Corean? And so the idea of the night mayor is, either, the head police or the shadow police, or, the party. And it's missing, in that word mayor, which is very much suggesting, a thoughtful generalist, somebody who is looking at every aspect of the city, but also looking across City Hall at every single department. And so it's not merely the buy-in, but is an institutional or somebody who's committed to it, because night mayors are generalists, thoughtful generalists, but also bridge builders and collaborators. And so if you have an institution in which every department is a black box, then it doesn't matter how much buy-in if the mayor doesn't actually, as it were, open up the different parts, open up the institutions. So the kind of conversations and the work of constant persuasion and bridge building that so much of the night mayors, the night commissioners, directors of Nightlife have to do, then it's going to be again, run into the same problems that so many cities run in when it's trying to come from bottom up, which often, they don't get too far. So it's a buy-in, but with also a commitment, or at least an openness to this person being a generalist, able to roam and move through and work with multiple departments within the institution.
Yes, what it's clear is that there's something happening. There's having all these cities, appoint these kind of roles is a symptom of there's growing interest and growing awareness of the relevance of thinking about the night in a different way. But still, there's a lot to be done to convince policymakers to, gather the resources, gather the support internally and also externally to make these solutions and these plans happen. We have fantastic questions coming in from the audience, and I'm going to start reading those. But before we move on, one thing that I wanted to share with you is that we're trying to gather all these, as I said before, there's a growing community internationally that are putting together solutions, strategies, plans, all kinds of ideas to manage life at night. We don't have to start from scratch. There's a lot of knowledge outside. So with the World Economic Forum, there's a new platform, a new initiative. When you go to the QR code, you can access the information. It's a 24-hour economy community that is hopefully going to help build some of that common knowledge and help push this field forward, and also understand what kinds of skills, training, and capacity building we need, not only for our cities, but also for different private sector actors and community actors that want to be part of this conversation. And so I'm getting really interesting questions, and I'm always fascinated about this part. It's my favorite part about these panels because it's a new field. It's a lot of curiosity. So I'm getting questions about what hours of the day do you work if you only work at night?
24 hours, baby.
9 to 5.
And there's also a very interesting question that comes from Barbara, who's the mayor of Columbia, Missouri, who's in the chat. And it's asking about managing people how do you manage people experiencing homelessness in open spaces at night? So it's very important to think about not only those who enjoy and work at night, but also those who inhabit the night in another way. I don't know if any of you have any answers or thoughts about how to tackle this aspect of our life at night in our cities.
Well, I think, again, this is not a problem that is a nighttime problem. This is a 24-hour-a-day problem, and it's a poverty issue, and we need more funding to take care of the unhoused population, and we need to have more shelters. And this is not the role of the night mayor. This is a role of the day mayor and the higher levels of governments.
I know here in Cambridge and in Boston and in New York City and in Berlin and in New Orleans, those are the ones coming to mind I can remember now. Different, religious, institutions, other community centers and members who would open their doors at night for people who are unhoused, and they're there. And then in the morning before they begin the day, everybody's out, and they get ready for the activities or the roles often associated with those institutions. Mm-hmm. And so this isn't necessarily solving the problem, but one of the things that actually happens, and these are part of the rich opportunities of someone like a nightmare, a night czar, is to spot and to recognize these things that are happening and ask questions like, can we do this at greater scale, or can we say have fundings or grants that would incentivize people to do things like this. Mm-hmm. And so I know that there is work being done often at a small scale, and ways that are hidden in the day. But that suddenly opens up, possibilities to begin thinking in different experiments, different possibilities around addressing different pockets of homelessness across cities.
One question we're also getting here that is a very important one is how cities, what kinds of programs cities have to support night shift workers' health, from police officers to nurses to food delivery riders. And not only physical health, but also mental health. any inspirational programs? And I know we also have folks from New York here in the audience who have done really great work.
So what the city of Boston has created is a platform on our website. So if you go to the Nightlife website, boston.gov/nightlife, we have a one-stop shop for folks who work, live, or want to do business at night. And a part of that is kind of taking all of the city's services and the resources available and putting them on one landing page, so that folks who are looking for mental health services, or want to pull a permit, or want to go to a healthcare fair, all that information is kind of in one space. So it's a one-stop shop. It's called Night School, and so we want to educate folks who are dealing in the night about what resources are available for them.
I think those last two questions really demonstrate the shift in perception over what these roles are post-COVID. Because we've talked about these roles in terms of 24-hour economy or night cultures for a long time. But since COVID, it's really about communities. And behind that, I think it's the concept of night care and caring for your residents who live, work, and play at night. So there's been a shift from, and a lot of these positions start in economic development, or they're in cultural services. In other cities, it's public safety or public health. So, and I think this is what we're seeing. We're seeing more and more people who are saying, hey, night mayors should take care of the people who live at night. And this will include the unhoused population. And this will include people who have issues with mental health or work night shifts. So it's a really interesting shift in perception, but this will need to be addressed in the structure of governance and in the definition of what the role of night mayor is.
Yeah, but it also requires a kind of diagnostic to look at the different things that we're working on or working in and ask, might the night give us a different way of approaching it? So, for example, you're speaking of, mental health, or different breaks, people, but something like urban design, ought to be thinking about that. What might, for example, the way we light a place or the way we light along the Charles do for people who want to take a stroll or who need a sense of relief, or we sometimes treat this like a luxury, the poetics of the city. But the poetics of the city are important. Where are places that I want to gather? Where are places that I want to retreat? Where are places of solitude or of gathering? How might light, how might the availability of public space, how might benches, rather than the typical hostile architecture that we do because we're so scared of the homeless, we don't want anywhere that anybody could possibly sit or lie or lean back. How might the presence of those begin to open up places and spaces and times in which people can have those kind of wellness breaks, mental health breaks that are so necessary to inhabiting the city.
So the night is providing a new lens to look at problems that we have in our cities, common problems, but to address them from a different perspective. I wonder if there's any questions here in the room. Oh yeah, there's a question here in the back.
Thank you so much. So, I remember you mentioned that one of the role was to explore of nightmares was to explore if the nighttime can be a space for other activities. You mentioned the Philharmonic's concert, for example. How do you imagine that going forward? How do you imagine drawing the boundaries between increasing the nightlife with the behaviors or the habits of daytime people? For example, if you want to create a loud event, how do you see that being accepted by people who would traditionally sleep at night, for example? And also another question was, what do you think are the implications to health? For example, if you want the nightlife to be a bigger space, to have more market, then I imagine it would attract more people, or you would encourage more people to be awake at night. And how do you imagine that affecting the daytime activities of the city? Thank you.
Who wants to take a stab at it? You?
Well, what I would say is we are shifting culture, and culture shifting takes a lot of time, and it takes buy-in from neighborhoods, residents, business owners. And I think about our neighborhoods as ecosystems in the way that I try to explain to neighborhood associations or to business associations on this is why we want to increase this, or this is why we would change this. It's because we need one to support the other. And buy-in and bringing these folks along in the process of, hey, this business wants to extend their hours until 2 a.m. to feed the student population. Explaining to the residents, hey, this is beneficial to your particular neighborhood because of X, Y, and Z, and bringing them along and hearing their concerns, and then having that open dialogue is a part of that culture shifting. It's not going to happen overnight, but having these conversations open and being thoughtful of bringing people in from the beginning is super important when we're changing neighborhoods like downtown or other locations throughout the city where we want more vibrancy at night.
We're not trying to sell the night. The night is there anyway. It's been there for forever. Humans have been telling stories around the fire for forever. And I would even argue that in the capitalist system we live, there's less and less time to socialize at night, and more time during the day or to work all the time. And nightlife is important right now, I think, because it's a socializing time. And it's in a time of political polarization where we argue online with strangers. I think it's much better to argue with face-to-face with people, because maybe after a few drinks, you might find some common ground around it. The relationship with residents and people, this opposition of people who want to sleep and people who want to be up at night and party. We're all both. Sometimes I want to go out and sometimes I want to sleep. And the person that wants to sleep that night will want to go out the next night, maybe. So I think it's all about finding balance and recognizing that night is a fact of urban life. And for some people, including myself, it's probably the most important identity marker that I have. I define myself first and foremost as a night owl, not as a person who's it's not my religion, it's not my skin color, it's not my language that defines me. It's living at night. So I can be with my peers anywhere in the world. When I'm with people who live at night, I feel like I'm amongst my peers. So recognizing this identity, I think, is an important step into developing programs to care about these communities, these nighttime communities and the nightlife communities, and giving them the space to live in their own city, and they have as much right to the night as anybody else.
Can I add to that just a little bit? I try to disarm the night, because a lot of folks don't see themselves. They're like, I'm in bed by 9 p.m. Why do I even care? But so I use this antidote. Well, if your child's sick and you need Motrin and you go to the medicine cabinet and there's none there, where are you going to buy it from? Is there a store open at 1 a.m. when you need to administer that medicine? So I try to humanize it and realize it for folks who don't necessarily see themselves. And that kind of opens the conversation up for change.
The other thing to notice is to think about is also, we're not trying to, as it were, drag more people into the night. People are already there in the night. And so if we're thinking about the health issues, asking, how do we cater to those who are already inhabiting the night? But also is to recognize the figures in state after state in the US, country after country, that more and more people are heading to the night because the day is becoming increasingly unbearable. So if you think about what is happening with heat in a globally, which is why it's not a coincidence that a lot of people who are involved in heat studies are the same people who are involved in night studies. So, and then so also why it's important for us as we're thinking about the night to look at what other cities and other countries are doing. Looking at Aleppo, for example, or looking at Dubai, has something to say to Phoenix, in which nobody wants to be hanging out at 112 degrees at 5 p.m. And so 9 p.m., 10 p.m., when it cools down more, becomes a way of being around together. And so a way of answering both questions is to think more people are going to be inhabiting the night, partially for health reasons. And there are people already in the night who are not being catered to, which is a health issue. And so how then do we deal with what actually is and try to actually make it more bearable, and even go beyond the bare minimum with bearable to make it equitable?
I'm getting a lot of questions. I see your hand 1 second. I'm getting a lot of questions about how the night changes. It's not the same. Issues around redevelopment, gentrification. We've been talking a lot about identity, but identity sometimes changes. The identity of a place is not fixed. And sometimes people who were, night owls and party animals, they get older, they have kids, and their preferences change. One thing that I would like for us to discuss a little bit is how can we prepare our cities for these changes? Because what we see in large cities like New York that have a trajectory and a history of nightlife is that it's there and we manage it. But in cities where the potential to distribute nightlife into other suburbs, into other parts of town where it's not as concentrated or where it could grow still, how can we plan for the future? How do we future-proof these nighttime scenes in a way that we take into account that this scene will shift?
I don't think you should distribute nightlife. I think nightlife comes out organically, and it will move from one neighborhood to another because of affordability. Because usually nightlife is a space of innovation, as your first article in your presentation was, talking about, mentioning. In New York, nightlife was in Manhattan, then moved to Brooklyn, then it's going to move to, this is what nightlife people do when it comes to cultural events, and they need these affordable spaces, and they will go where they can. So, nightlife is the light that comes out of the cracks of the sidewalk, if you want. So I think the role that we have as cities is to protect whatever comes out and try to protect it and make sure that it lasts. And of course, it will change. This is part of normal evolution, much as when you grow older, when you're 45, you might not have go out as much as when you were 19, except if you're a nightmare, of course, but that's another issue.
Yeah,
I want to answer the question at a different point in time, which is to say that studies have been coming out about the tight relationship with the development of nightlife and displacement. And so there are many cities, towns that got caught by surprise to say, wow, we didn't see this gentrification happening. And I said, well, you should have gone out at night. That the nightlife in many ways actually helped affect that. It suddenly becomes a area. Go talk to anybody who live in Kreuzberg, for example, or Neukölln in Berlin, between the 90s and now. And it was like, oh, we didn't see that gentrification coming. I said, well, the night people saw it coming in a years or in a months ahead of time. And so it means then, by giving that proper attention to the relationship between displacement and nightlife, cities can better plan. They can start asking some of the hard questions, start thinking about ways of not doing things that affect this mass displacement, or finding ways to help protect neighborhoods from changing too rapidly. Cities are places and engines of change. Change will come, but how do you make the change more humane? And so to look at the night then, and to look at the way nightlife can affect unwanted change, or in a too rapid change, which then causes gentrification, displacement, and a number of things, is something worth worth thinking about as cities think about in a developing nightlife. You can't develop a nightlife without also seeing sometimes some of the unintended consequences that come along with it.
Look at how creative we got when we had this huge change with COVID happening in 2020, and we had to reinvent the way we did everything. But there's a question over there in the audience. And
hi, thank you guys so much. This is like a really fascinating conversation. One thing that stuck out to me was the idea about nightlife, or night as a space, and like people being perceived as like lingering versus loitering. And so I'm kind of curious about the different strategies or things that you're thinking about creating space that's like safe and inviting for all types of people in the night versus how that might look in the day.
Lighting was brought up a lot on this panel, and lighting is used to help the perception of safety. Right? If I'm walking down the street and there's one street that's well lit and one that's not so well lit, I'm going to go down the the well-lit street. It's that perception of safety. And often that's it. It might not be an unsafe place, but is it perceived as an unsafe place? What we've done in our downtown area is just activate spaces and welcome folks to spaces that may have had that perception of unsafety, and try to create community and a thriving nightlife in those areas to ensure that folks are interacting with each other, and there's a change in the story of what that area is compared to what the perception has been in the past.
And
Go ahead.
and to hold officials accountable in the right way. It's interesting to look at. Sometimes you can almost tell the time wasters in terms of officials, that the ones who come into office and the first thing they're saying is like, a lot more lights. I actually had my students do that, just trace a whole bunch of different elections and look at the people who just ran with a narrative of light, and they're just like, we're just blasting place with light. And so they get the idea of like, oh, it's safety, when many times it was no more safe, because again, too much light and too little light are just as ineffective. And so in other words, in a ways of actually holding people to better ways of thinking about lighting, something as simple as lighting, and then also in a ways of actually like not having them link that lighting narrative with the safety narrative, or driving fear, and said, I'm your savior, Gotham is safe under me, and so to hold them to in account, but with that something as simple as that, which has huge effects.
I think we gotta consider how we judge the movement of bodies within space at night versus the day. Like, you take a public plaza or a placette, and or a bench in a park, during the day, people are lingering.
Right.
They're sitting down, they're chatting. This is lingering. And then when the sun goes down, all of a sudden, this is loitering. Because at night, the bodies must be in movement. And this is what feeds into our perception of safety. And I think part of our position, our job, is to change that perception and bring in tolerance around this, and that it's not a nuisance to have kids lingering in the public space at night. It's for them, it's a socialization time, and it's an important time, and there's different ways to address challenges and issues that might come out of that than just removing the benches at night. And
Can you say something about what you do back in Ottawa with the night walks, which actually helps towards that?
Yeah, well, the night walks, I got this from a French geographer, Luc Vandinsky, who's one of the founder of the night studies field, and he takes counselors and city staff and mayors, and he makes them walk the city at night. And he does it for much longer than I do in Ottawa, because sometimes I do it in the winter and it's minus 20, 20 Celsius in Ottawa. So, he walks the whole night from 10 p.m. until 4 or 5 a.m. And then what happens is, at some point you'll have these daytime people who need to go to the restroom, and it's 3:30 a.m. and there's nowhere to go, and you can go in the park, because that's what people do at night. They do it in the park because there's nowhere else to do it. And this brings all of a sudden a realization about, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't have these bathrooms. But if we have these public restrooms, then people are going to sleep in it. But, so it's always about, like, let's remove something from the night instead of managing it. And I think that's what we should be looking for. And doing these night walks have been instrumental in bringing this perception, this new realization about how can we manage the night, and what is the reality of people who live and work at night, that you can't go pee, and sometimes you want to eat something, you're hungry, and the only thing that's open is maybe a McDonald's 3 kilometers away. So, what does that tell you about your city?
That's a great reflection to wrap up, because it's key that it's clear that our cities and our perception of cities during the night is very different from during the day. We were talking earlier this morning how something as simple as a bicycle rack during the day, at night, could be used for people just to linger, to sit around, to smoke, creating sound that disturbs the residents sleeping upstairs. So thinking about, this is an invitation, I think, this panel, to encourage us to think about how our experience of the night should be something that we systematically observe that we keep an eye on how it's changing, on who's involved, but also who's being left out, and how we reflect that in our policies through new institutions, new roles, new support for these departments, but as well, we need more studies. We need more information and more data that will help us and guide our cities into better take advantage of the night as a space for opportunity and for growth. And thank you so much for everyone who joined remotely and everyone here in the audience. It's been great, and our fantastic panelists, and hope to continue this conversation soon.
Thank you.